Welcome to Dependable Flame, where we explore vintage petrol lighters, ashtrays, tobacconiana, and other useful mechanisms. Make yourself at home. Today we have a really cool old Park Industries advertising lighter promoting a Ford automobile that was never actually put into production. I am really familiar with old Mustangs. My first automobile was a 1970 Mustang Fastback. So my youth and adolescence was filled with old cars and dreaming about Mustangs, and yet for some reason I had never heard of the Ford Mach 2. But a Google search found a Ford performance website that talks about the Ford Mach 2 as a concept car that was actually in development through 3 different phases, beginning pretty early in 1966 and being abandoned sometime in the early 1970s. The Ford Mach 2, from everything that I read on that Ford Performance website, was intended to be in direct competition with the 2-seat Chevy Corvette. In its earliest stages, it did not even have the name Mach 2, and by its later stages, I believe it had been given the name Ford Mustang Mach 2. There are pictures on the internet of some of the cars that were developed in the research for this automobile. And while the automobile itself was never put into production, they did plenty of research on it with chassis from Mustangs, Cougars. At one point they used the chassis of a Maverick. And it sounds like the project was basically killed by the fact that they could not come up with a transaxle that would accommodate the motor and transmissions that they were trying to use to meet the performance that they needed to mount any kind of serious challenge to the Corvette, which by that point, obviously, the Corvette, which had come out in the 1950s, was well established, and Ford had plenty of muscle cars by this point in the late 1960s and early 1970s, but nothing that competed head to head with the Corvette, as basically the Thunderbird had done back in the 50s. The Thunderbird ended up becoming a bigger sedan type automobile, whereas the Corvette remained a 2-seater. And as far as I know, the Corvette has always been a 2-seat automobile. But I think it's very interesting that Park Industries was employed to produce an advertising lighter for the Ford Mach 2 when the automobile itself was never produced. This is a high polished chrome, heavy gauge case, although by looking inside, there is a silver tone inside the lid, whereas the actual bottom case looks to be darker, more like brass. I don't know if that lid is maybe painted to get that silverish tone, if it might be plated on the inside, whereas typically they're not. But both appear to be a heavier gauge metal than aluminum, whereas the lighter mechanism is definitely largely made of aluminum. Marked on the back side, precision made by Park Industries, Murfreesboro, Tennessee, USA. The wick looks pretty clean, just a little bit of dust contamination. Same with the felt pad, wadding, and then the lower part of that wick, everything looks original. The flint tube was clogged up with old flint when I got this lighter. It also has a plastic flint spring screw, which I would urge you to be careful with. If you buy this lighter, or if you have other park lighters that have that plastic screw, you will see a lot of times that the color from the plastic screw will bleed off into the felt pad, and you also see a lot of times where they will break off very easily. So everything is good here. No flint in the tube, degraded, new, or otherwise. And you can see here, when we lower that flint spring into the tube, it makes solid contact with the file wheel. So for this lighter to be functional, you would just need to add a flint, which there will be a flint in a plastic bag included along with this lighter. And I probably should use a caveat and just say that there is a chance that this lighter will not be sold. I have talked a lot about my dad and him being a Ford guy, and my first automobile definitely being a Ford also. I have considered myself a Ford guy for most of my life. The last F-150 that I drove may have cured me of that. The tolerance in those Ford truck engines with regard to removing spark plugs is something that is a major problem. And not only that, but those engines throwing rods and not having the life that one would have come to expect from a Ford automobile may have cured me of being a Ford fan. I'm more than happy to drive my Jeep nowadays. You can definitely see the scuffs, scratches, plenty of wear of that sort. Not a perfect lighter, but this is really a relic of a different time, and kind of puzzling to me to think that the Ford Motor Company would have commissioned a lighter like this to be made when they never really even got around to any solid plans to produce the automobile that this lighter was promoting. So really interesting relic of Ford history that they would have created a lighter for the Ford, what was eventually, at least in the press and the material that came out of the Ford Motor Company, was referred to as the Ford Mustang Mach 2, which, even though we had to clean that flint tube out, this lighter is still technically brand new, and yet there was never a new Ford Mach 2 that rolled off the assembly line. So we've been struggling with getting a good view of this graphic for this entire video. I put a little white screen up here to the side to help you see it a little bit better. I need to come up with a little bit better solution of lighting when it comes to these high polished chrome lighters. It's very difficult to show them off without some white in the background. So it is still to be determined whether this lighter will be listed or be part of my collection. It's not ultra sentimental to me because, as far as I can remember, my dad and I never even discussed the Ford Mach 2, which he might have had some personal knowledge of, having lived through that time. But I would have been too young in the early 70s if it was still going on then. But the majority of this project seems to have taken place at the Ford Motor Company from 1966 moving forward through the late 1960s. Until next time.